father cast his daughter out for loving another woman, but he had once been just like her. You will not believe the secret this man kept hidden his entire life until his daughter uncovered it, just days before he died. Maple Glen was the kind of town where the church bells rang every Sunday morning without fail, where neighbors greeted each other with polite nods but rarely strayed beyond pleasantries. Life moved slowly there, rhythmically, like the ticking of the antique grandfather clocks that seemed to stand in every living room. Children grew up under watchful eyes, and adults lived by codes that were never questioned, because they had been written not in ink, but in generations of silence. Claire Hamilton had grown up in one of the older houses on the outskirts of town, a white colonial home with weather-worn shutters and a carefully trimmed lawn. To an outsider, the Hamilton household looked pristine, quiet, respectable, steeped in tradition. But behind the closed doors, Claire had learned early on that order came at a cost. Her father, Raymond Hamilton, believed in discipline the way a general believed in tactics, without compromise and with absolute conviction. He was a man of few words, but every word he did speak carried weight, sharpened by decades of religious certainty. "The Lord does not reward softness," he once told Claire, not looking up from the Bible he read each morning at 6. Helen, Claire's mother, floated through the house like a shadow. She folded laundry in silence, served dinner with mechanical precision, and kept her voice low even when she was alone with Claire. Her hands were always busy, her eyes always tired. There was no warmth between Helen and Raymond, only routine, a dance of duty performed across decades. When Claire cried as a child, Helen would stroke her hair gently but never speak. When Claire asked questions, her mother would offer half smiles instead of answers, as though speaking too much might upset some delicate balance. Claire learned to watch, not ask. She knew which shoes her father wore to church and which tie he considered disrespectful. She knew that she should never interrupt a prayer, that laughter during dinner was frowned upon, and that talking back was a sin on par with theft. Her father's beliefs, like the wallpaper in the hallway, never changed. "You obey," he often said. "You do not question. That is how we survive in this world." The walls of the house seemed to hold their breath, absorbing words that were never spoken and feelings that were never allowed. Even as a teenager, Claire felt like an outsider within her own home. She longed to breathe freely, to laugh too loudly, to sing without fear of being told to be quiet. But such things were luxuries in the Hamilton household, luxuries that love, in its rigid, conditional form, never permitted. And so she folded her dreams into silence, just as her mother had done, at least for a while. It happened in late autumn, when the leaves outside had turned a bruised red and gold, and the air inside the Hamilton house had grown colder than the wind that rattled the kitchen windows. Claire had waited until the dinner plates were cleared, until her father had folded his napkin and pushed his chair back with that familiar scrape of wood on tile. She had rehearsed the words 100 times, but when she finally said them, they felt like someone else's voice, breaking open the silence like a stone through glass. "I am in love with someone," she said. "Her name is Emily." For a moment, there was no sound at all. Her mother stood at the sink, one hand still in a bowl of soapy water, frozen mid-motion. Her father stared at her, unblinking, as if he had not understood. Then, slowly, his jaw tightened, his fingers curled into fists against the armrests of his chair. "You what?" he asked, though the room already knew the answer. Claire's heart pounded, but she held her ground. "I am bisexual," she said. "Emily and I have been together for nearly a year." Raymond stood up so suddenly that his chair toppled behind him. His face was red with something beyond anger, something ancient, learned, and buried so deep that it came out like instinct. "This is filth," he hissed. "Do not bring shame into my house. You dare come here and mock the word of God. You dare parade your perversion like a trophy?" Helen still did not move. Her eyes stayed fixed on the soapy water, as if by not seeing, she could unhear it all. Claire tried to speak, but he was already reaching for the hallway closet, already pulling out the old suitcase she had not used since high school choir trips. He slammed it on the floor and pointed toward the stairs. "Get your things," he barked. "You are not my daughter. Not like this." Her voice cracked as she whispered, "You always said obedience was love, but I will not kill myself to make you comfortable." That was the last thing she said before she walked upstairs, numb, her legs barely carrying her. She packed quickly, just a few clothes, a journal, the locket her grandmother had given her. No one followed her. No one stopped her. When she came back down, her suitcase in one hand and winter coat clutched in the other, her mother was standing in the hallway, still silent. Their eyes met. Helen opened her mouth slightly, but no words came. Claire waited. Just one word, one gesture, something. But Helen only lowered her gaze, as if shame belonged solely to the daughter standing in front of her. Outside, the night was sharp and breathless. The porch light flickered overhead as Claire stepped into the cold, the door closing behind her like the ceiling of a vault. She walked down the gravel path without looking back. Her cheeks burned, not from wind, but from the heat of humiliation, of abandonment. She'd always known that love in that house came with conditions, but she had never imagined how quickly it could disappear once those conditions were broken. Snow began to fall softly around her, catching in her hair as she reached the road. She had no destination, only the clarity that whatever future she was walking toward could not possibly be more suffocating than the place she had left behind. The bus to Philadelphia arrived just before dawn, its windows fogged with breath and sleep, its aisles littered with torn tickets, and the hum of quiet, desperate prayers. Claire sat in the back, her suitcase wedged against her legs, her eyes fixed on the blur of streetlights slipping past like ghosts. She had not cried, not on the porch, not on the road, not even when she handed over the last of her savings for the bus fare. But as the city skyline came into view, jagged and unfamiliar, something inside her cracked, not from grief, but from sheer exhaustion. She stepped off the bus with nowhere to go. For the first 3 nights, she slept on a couch in a shelter that smelled faintly of bleach and old coffee. The volunteers there gave her a pillow, a granola bar, and a list of places she could call for work. It was not kindness exactly, but it was not cruelty either. And that was enough. By the end of the first week, she had a job washing dishes in a small Mediterranean restaurant near South Street. The owner barely looked at her, but he paid in cash and did not ask questions. In the mornings, she worked part-time at a daycare center, feeding toddlers applesauce and singing songs she remembered from Sunday school, the irony of it not lost on her. At night, she swept floors, folded towels, and saved every cent she could. There was no sudden salvation, no miraculous turn of fortune, only days that stacked on top of each other, slow and heavy, until Claire began to recognize herself again, not as the girl who had been thrown out, but as a woman who refused to disappear. She rented a room in a basement apartment, painted the walls pale yellow, and filled it with secondhand books and thrift store candles. The first time she bought a plant, she cried. It was a small thing, but it was hers. When she finally enrolled in university, it felt like trespassing into someone else's dream. She chose social work not because it was safe, but because it mattered. Each lecture on trauma, on resilience, on systemic injustice carved a deeper understanding of her own survival. The theories had names, the wounds had context, and she was no longer alone in the dark. By her 3rd year, she had become a peer counselor at the campus LGBTQ+ Resource Center. She listened to stories that sounded far too much like her own, young people who had been rejected, silenced, erased. She sat with them through panic attacks, walked them to shelters, helped them write scholarship applications and letters of appeal. And every time someone said thank you, Claire felt both honored and haunted. She was helping others piece themselves back together, even as some part of her still lived on that porch, on that night, beneath a flickering light. She built a life from fragments. It was not glamorous. It was not easy. But it was real. She smiled more. She danced without fear. She kissed without shame. But late at night, when the city quieted and the hum of distant sirens faded, there were still echoes of the past that clung to her like mist. The absence of her family was not a wound that bled, but it was one that never fully closed. It was a Wednesday afternoon in late spring, the kind of day where the air felt clean and the sun filtered gently through the curtains of Claire's tiny office at the community center. She had just finished speaking with a teenager who had been sleeping in her car for the past week when her phone buzzed on the desk. Unknown number. Normally, she would have let it ring, but something, intuition, or maybe just a faint pull from some quiet corner of her memory, made her pick up. "Claire," the voice on the other end said, brittle and breathless. "It is Aunt Diane. I know it has been a long time." Claire sat down slowly, the name stirring something half-buried. "I am calling because your father, Raymond, had a stroke yesterday morning. The doctors say he might not have long." There was a long silence on Claire's end. Her aunt's voice softened, hesitant. "Your mother asked me to call. She thought, you should know." Claire's mouth was dry. She thanked her mechanically and hung up. For a long time after, she sat without moving. Outside, the street noise continued. Buses rumbling, someone's music pulsing from a passing car, birds chattering in the alleyway. The world kept spinning, as if the call had been a pebble dropped into a vast, indifferent sea. She did not cry. Instead, she made a cup of tea and sat with it on the fire escape, knees pulled to her chest, watching the sky change colors over the rooftops. A decade had passed since she last saw her father's face. In that time, she had become someone else entirely, stronger, steadier, unrecognizable to the version of herself who had once stood trembling on a cold front porch. And yet the thought of going back made something small and shivering awaken inside her. That night, sleep would not come. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, hearing his voice again in her mind. Not the rage, not the sermons, but the moments between. The quiet judgment. The impossible weight of never being enough. She thought of her mother, too, standing by the sink, hands submerged in water, mouth never opening. She did not owe them anything. That was the truth. Not forgiveness, not explanation, and certainly not her presence. But another truth lingered beside it, quieter but persistent. She was not going back for them. She was going back because she had questions that only silence had answered for too long, because the house on the hill, with all its ghosts and grief, was a chapter she had never been allowed to finish. When morning came, she packed a small bag with careful hands. She closed the windows, locked the door behind her, and took the first train north. Back to Maple Glen. Back to the house where love had been conditional and truth had been forbidden. Not to seek comfort, not to heal old wounds, but to face the story that had once tried to erase her and to reclaim it as her own. The taxi turned off the main road and began the slow climb up the familiar hill, tires crunching over gravel that seemed untouched by time. Through the dusty window, Claire saw it, still standing, still white, still framed by the same old hedges and the slant of overgrown camellia bushes. The house had not changed, but the years had stripped it of its illusion. The paint was flaking at the corners of the windows, the porch sagged just slightly, and the swing that used to creak in the wind hung still, chain rusted and seat rotting. As the car rolled to a stop, Claire's fingers curled tighter around the strap of her bag. Her legs were steady, but her breath came with a weight she had not felt in years. She stepped out slowly, her boots pressing into the familiar earth, and stood there for a moment just looking, like someone peering into a childhood photograph and trying to find herself inside it. The door opened before she could knock. Helen stood in the doorway, a thin sweater pulled around her shoulders despite the mild weather. She had aged, more than Claire expected. The lines around her eyes were deeper, her frame smaller, and her posture hunched as though the years had folded her in. But something in her eyes had softened. The fear was no longer as sharp, as ready. For the first time in Claire's memory, her mother looked not like someone waiting for permission to speak, but like someone who knew silence was no longer enough. They stood facing each other. Neither moved. "Claire?" Helen said at last. Her voice was thinner. drier, but not trembling. Claire nodded. "Hi, Mom." There was no embrace, only a quiet step aside as Helen opened the door wider. Inside, the house smelled like lemon polish and wilted flowers. The same carpet lined the hallway, the same pictures hung on the wall. Claire as a baby in a white christening dress, Claire in kindergarten holding a Bible, Claire smiling stiffly in a stiff Easter dress beside Raymond. None of those smiles had reached her eyes. She followed her mother into the kitchen. It was unchanged, too. The ticking wall clock, the wooden cross by the window, the faded curtain with small embroidered doves. But now there were pill bottles near the sink, stacked neatly beside a schedule written in Helen's careful script. An oxygen machine hummed softly from the living room. "He is in the back room," Helen said, pouring tea that neither of them asked for. "He cannot speak anymore. The stroke, it took most of his words. Sometimes he can nod or blink. That is all." Claire stared at the steam rising from the tea, watching it twist and disappear. Her mother sat across from her but did not drink. "I did not think you would come back," Helen said finally, not accusingly, just stating what was true. "I did not think I would either." Another long silence settled between them, dense but not hostile. There was no warmth, not yet, but there was a strange kind of stillness, a space that had not existed before, one that felt less like a wall and more like a pause. "I did not know what to say back then," Helen said suddenly, her hands wrapped around the ceramic mug. "I wanted to speak, I did, but I was so afraid." Claire looked at her, and for the first time she did not see cowardice. She saw the years of a woman taught to endure, not to choose. Still, the old ache stirred inside her. "You watched him throw me out," she said, her voice calm but unflinching. "You watched me leave with nothing." Helen's eyes filled, but she did not turn away. "I know," she whispered. "I think about it every day." The air between them thinned. Neither forgiveness nor blame was exchanged. But in that moment, a sliver of truth passed between mother and daughter, quiet and sharp. Claire stood slowly. "I want to see him," she said. Helen nodded and led her down the hallway. As they passed the old pictures on the wall, Claire felt each one like a breath on her neck. Reminders of a version of herself she had been told to forget. And yet, here she was. Not a prodigal child returning for approval, but a woman stepping back into the house that had tried to erase her, ready at last to look it in the eye. The door to the back room creaked softly as Helen pushed it open, revealing a dim space washed in pale light from a single window. The curtains were half drawn, and the scent of antiseptic clung faintly to the air, mingling with something older. Wood polish, lavender, dust. Raymond lay in a narrow hospital bed, his body sunken beneath the covers, mouth slightly open, eyes half-lidded but tracking movement with effort. Claire hesitated on the threshold, her breath held without realizing. He looked so small now. Not the towering figure who once thundered through the house like an absolute truth, but a man carved down by time and silence. Machines hummed at his side, steady and indifferent. The only movement was the slow, mechanical rise and fall of his chest. She stepped forward quietly, each footfall a ripple in memory. He turned his head just slightly toward her, a flicker of recognition, or perhaps memory, passing through his eyes. Claire spoke first, her voice low. "I came back." There was no answer, of course, only a blink slow and deliberate. She did not say more. She sat beside the bed, her fingers folded tightly in her lap, heart beating a rhythm she could not name. She did not cry. She had no words of comfort to offer, no final questions to ask. The person she had needed him to be had died long before the stroke. What lay here now was only the remainder of what had never been said. Later that evening, the house grew quiet again. Claire stood in the hallway outside the room, watching the light fade through the window, shadows stretching across the wood floor like fingers. Helen joined her, leaning on the doorframe, her eyes fixed on the last sliver of sun. "I want to tell you something," Helen said softly after a long moment. "Something I should have said a long time ago." Claire turned toward her, unsure of what was coming. "You are not the first," Helen whispered, "to be different, to be unwelcome." Claire stared at her, confused. Helen's hands fidgeted at her sides, pulling at the edge of her sweater. "When your father was young, before he met me, there was someone. A man. His name was Thomas." The name fell like a stone into the stillness between them. They were close, too close for how things were back then. His parents found letters, photographs. I do not know all the details, but they sent him away, a camp, church run, far out in the country. He never spoke of it, not even when we were married. Claire's lips parted slightly, but no words came. Helen's eyes were wet, her voice trembling. I think they broke something in him. He came back different, colder, afraid, maybe. He chose the only life they left for him. Chose me, the church, respectability. And when you told him the truth, he saw something he thought he had buried. Claire stepped back, hands pressing against the wall for balance. Her father, the man who had disowned her for loving Emily, had once stood where she stood now, had once loved, deeply enough to be punished for it. The betrayal cut deeper than any sermon, any shouted threat. He had known, and he had turned that same fear outward, onto her. Helen looked at her daughter, her voice now quiet and resolute. "You were never wrong, Claire. He was. But I think he was afraid of what you reminded him of. Afraid that if he loved you, as you were, he would have to face who he had once been." For the first time in years, Claire felt something shatter. Not anger, but something heavier. A sadness so vast it filled her lungs like smoke. All those years, all that silence. A lifetime of damage passed down like inheritance. She turned back toward the bedroom. The shape beneath the blankets did not move. "He could have stopped it," she whispered, not to Helen, but to no one. "He could have broken the chain." Helen nodded. "But he did not, and you have." Claire did not answer. She simply stood there in the gathering dusk, the house creaking gently around her as if sighing under the weight of all it had held for too long. Later that night, when the house had settled into its old bones and the wind had begun to pick at the corners of the shutters, Claire returned to the room where her father lay. The hallway was dim, lit only by a small lamp above the staircase, casting long shadows that stretched like memories across the walls. She paused at the door, hand resting lightly on the frame, listening to the low, mechanical rhythm of breath and silence inside. She stepped in quietly, pulling the chair beside the bed a little closer. He was awake. His eyes followed her, slow and deliberate, blinking once, then again. There was awareness there, dull but present. The muscles of his face barely moved, but something behind his gaze stirred when he looked at her. Not recognition of her name, perhaps, but of her presence, of the weight she carried into that room. Claire sat, folding her hands in her lap, her voice slow and measured. "I know now," she said, "about Thomas." No response, just the faintest shift of his eyes like a ripple beneath ice. Her hands trembled slightly, but she did not look away. "You knew what it felt like. To be afraid, to be punished for loving someone." Still nothing. Not a sound. Only the machine at his side and the shallow rise of his chest. "You could have protected me," she said, voice tightening. "You could have told me it was going to be all right. But you chose to make me feel ashamed, like I was the one who broke something." His jaw twitched, barely perceptible, but there. "You could have told me you understood," she said. "You could have given me something, anything other than silence." The tears came without warning, hot and slow, not in waves, but in a slow leak from something too old to be named. She wiped at them with the back of her hand and kept going. "I waited for you to love me as I was, and you never did, not once. You stood there and watched me walk out that door like I was the enemy, and you knew what it meant." His eyes blinked rapidly, and suddenly they flooded. Tears gathered at the corners and slipped down his temple, trailing into his hairline. He could not speak. His mouth moved, trembling faintly, but no words came. Claire leaned in closer, her voice no longer angry, just tired. Why did you not protect me? There was no answer. There never would be. Only the slow, silent weeping of a man who had spent his life running from his own reflection. Claire sat back in the chair, the quiet surrounding them like thick fog. She did not reach for his hand. She did not comfort him. But she stayed, watching as the tears continued to fall from his unmoving face. And for the first time, she saw him not as the man who had cast her out, but as someone deeply broken, too broken to protect her, too broken to save himself. And though no forgiveness passed between them, something else did. Not absolution, but understanding, bruised and incomplete. It would never be enough, but it would have to be. The next morning, the air in the house felt heavier, thick with quiet that pressed against the walls like fog. Claire awoke early, though she had barely slept. Her body was still, but her mind churned, dragging pieces of memory through the hours like broken glass across stone. Her father had not spoken, could no longer speak, but his tears from the night before lingered in her thoughts, a weight she could not quite place. They had said nothing, yet something had been exchanged. Not peace, perhaps, but truth. A raw, wounded kind of truth neither of them could take back. Helen had left for the grocery store. She had insisted on going, saying they were out of milk and bread, as if small routines could hold back the tide of everything else. Claire remained behind, pacing the house slowly. Her eyes caught details she had once ignored, the small crack in the wall beneath the staircase, the way the floorboards bowed slightly under her feet, the familiar hum of the refrigerator cycling through its rhythm. The past had not just returned, it had been waiting here all along. Drawn by something unspoken, she found herself in her parents' bedroom. The door groaned as it opened, revealing the same floral quilt folded over the bed, the same stack of devotionals on the nightstand. Time seemed to have stopped in this room, as if memory had settled like dust across every surface. She moved toward the closet, sliding open the wooden door with care. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar and old fabric. Her father's suits still hung in a neat row. Charcoal, navy, dark brown, all of them pressed and lined up like soldiers awaiting orders that would never come. At the very back, nearly hidden beneath a folded wool blanket, she spotted a small, worn box. She pulled it out gently, her heart already beating faster, as if her body understood what her mind had not yet grasped. The box was simple, unadorned, its edges softened by time. The latch stuck for a moment, then gave with a soft click. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all handwritten, some creased and yellowed, others crisp but never sent. Each was addressed the same way, in the same careful script. Thomas Albright, Creswell, Kentucky. Claire sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers trembling as she lifted the first one. It began plainly, with no date, no greeting, just a sentence that cut cleanly through the years. I still dream of the lake, of your hand on my back, of the way we could breathe when we were alone. She read one after another, unable to stop. They were not erotic. They were not dramatic. They were quiet, aching, filled with longing and confusion and guilt so deeply embedded it seemed to pulse from the page. Each letter spoke of love denied, a self unspoken, and the terror of being found out. And yet, through every word there was tenderness, an intimacy so foreign to the man she had known that it left her breathless. The last letter lay at the bottom of the stack. The date stopped her heart. June 12, 1993. She had been born 7 days later. The handwriting was shakier, the lines less composed. It was shorter than the rest. Thomas, she is coming. I know it now. I do not know if I am ready to be a father or a husband or anyone other than what they want me to be. But I have buried us so deep, I do not think I can find a way back. If I had one more chance, I would take your hand and run. Claire sat motionless, the letter open in her lap, her breath caught between past and present. The man who had cast her out had once written words like this, had once loved someone with the same desperation he later tried to extinguish in her. And he had chosen safety, chosen silence, chosen to become the very force that had crushed him. Tears slid down her cheeks, but she did not sob. There was no hysteria in it, only sorrow, only the unbearable knowledge that they might have been allies in another life. Father and daughter, both longing to be whole, both punished for love. She folded the letter and placed it back in the box, her hands slow and reverent. Then she closed the lid, not to hide it, but to carry it. This was her inheritance. Not the house, not the name, not the rigid faith written in stone. This was the truth she would not let die with him. When she left the room, the box pressed gently against her chest. She walked with a steadiness she had not felt in years. That evening, the sun dipped behind the hill in slow, deliberate strokes of orange and violet, casting long shadows across the porch and turning the windows of the house into mirrors. Claire stood in the hallway, the box of letters now resting quietly on her lap. She had placed it on the dining table where, once, family dinners had unfolded with rehearsed prayers and careful silences. Now it sat like a quiet confession beneath the fading light, proof that even the walls had not known the whole story. Helen was in the kitchen, folding laundry with her usual precision. Claire could hear the gentle rhythm of fabric being set into neat piles, but for once it did not feel like avoidance. It felt like presence. There was no rush to speak, no pressure to make sense of everything. They had both lived with the damage too long to believe it could be resolved with a single conversation. Claire stood and moved slowly through the house. Each step echoed with memory. The creak of the stairwell where she once sat eavesdropping on arguments muffled behind closed doors. The corner in the hallway where she had stood in timeout for questioning scripture during a family devotion. She passed the framed portraits still nailed perfectly level, each smile stiff, each image too clean. They stared back at her like curated myths, versions of a family that never truly existed. But she did not flinch now. She walked not as a child hoping to be seen, but as someone who had already seen the truth and chosen to stand in it. She paused at the living room window and looked out across the front yard, where brittle patches of grass broke through the gravel path. The camellia bushes leaned in toward the porch, their blooms beginning to fall, like gentle reminders that even beauty fades and that decay is also a kind of honesty. She would leave the next morning. She had already decided. There was nothing left to stay for, no need to wait for a reconciliation that would never come. But she would leave on her own terms, with the letters, with the knowledge of who her father had been, not just the man who condemned her, but the man who had once pleaded for love in the dark. That complexity mattered. She did not forgive him, not yet, but she would not carry him like a weight around her neck. That, she decided, was the end of the inheritance. As the last of the daylight slipped across the floor, she returned to the dining table and placed her hand gently on the box. It was not a burden now. It was a history reclaimed, a broken lineage acknowledged, and for the first time, Claire felt the silence of the house shift. Not collapse, not vanish, but yield. And in that yielding, something in her exhaled, not with peace, not with relief, but with clarity. And it was enough. The church was smaller than Claire remembered, though it had not changed. Same wood-paneled pews, same crimson cushions softened by decades of prayer and grief. The same pulpit her father had once spoken from during community events, offering words she had stopped believing in long before she left. The stained glass windows cast fractured light across the congregation, mostly old neighbors, a few distant cousins, and the careful, watchful eyes of a town that remembered too much and questioned too little. Claire sat near the front, alone. Helen was there, quiet and composed, hands folded in her lap like always. The pastor spoke first, offering familiar platitudes about faith, redemption, and the promise of eternal peace. It was a gentle eulogy, polite and rehearsed, clean in the way death often demands from the living. But it was not true, not the whole of it. When the pastor asked if anyone else would like to speak, a hush settled over the room like dust. Claire stood. The creak of her shoes on the wooden floor echoed through the silence as she walked to the front. She stood behind the lectern and looked out at the faces, some surprised to see her, some disapproving, some unreadable. She did not look for approval. She had not come for that. "My name is Claire Hamilton," she began, her voice steady. "I am Raymond's daughter." She let the pause sit. No one moved. "I know many of you knew my father as a strong man, disciplined, righteous, a man who stood for what he believed in. That was true, but it was not the whole truth." She took a breath, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the lectern. "My father lived most of his life in fear of being known, fear of losing control, fear of a part of himself that he was never allowed to name out loud, and that fear shaped everything, how he spoke, how he loved, how he parented." There was a flicker in the crowd. Someone shifted, but she went on. "But I have learned something else, too. He was not only fear, he was also longing, tenderness, buried so deep it turned to stone. And once, long ago, he loved someone, truly, and he lost that love, and he buried it. And in doing so, he forgot how to make space for anyone else to love freely." A long silence followed. Claire looked out at the congregation, not with bitterness, but with the calm of someone who no longer needed to explain herself. "I am not here to glorify, and I am not here to condemn. I am here to tell the truth, because silence has never protected anyone in this family." She stepped back, let the words linger, then returned to her seat without fanfare. The rest of the service passed like a shadow. Quiet hymns, folded programs, murmured condolences. When it was over, Claire did not stay long. She walked back to the house on the hill one final time, gathered her things, and stood in the doorway looking out across the town that had never quite seen her. Helen approached as she was about to leave. They did not hug, but their eyes met, and something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps. A beginning. Claire stepped off the porch. The path down the hill was the same gravel she had walked years ago, suitcase in hand, heart shattered. But this time she walked lighter. She was not running. She was not hiding. She carried no shame, no need for apology, only the letters in her bag and the quiet strength of someone who had faced the darkness of her origin and walked through it with her voice intact. She did not look back. There was nothing left behind her that she needed. Everything that mattered now was ahead.